Hi, folks, and welcome to another episode of Israel Explained. This one is a particularly sad one from the Israeli perspective. Um, in the last episode, we were just talking about how Hamas is breaking apart in its leadership, and all that is still true, and Israel is putting pressure on Hamas. But today, some tragic events put the war into a very different perspective. Um, Three hostages were killed by mistake by the IDF. We don't know all the details of their circumstances, but we generally know the contours of what happened. So it was 10 a.m. Um, when three unidentified figures were spotted by the IDF in Sajawiyah. They were considered to be a threat and killed by the IDF. When soldiers approached the bodies, they saw that they were unarmed and quickly identified them as Israeli hostages. Um, Two of the identities have been divulged publicly, and a third prefers to remain unnamed, or I should say their family prefers for them to remain um, unnamed. It's very hard to blame the soldiers for what happened. There's really no precedent yet in this war for hostages running around unaccompanied in a war zone. And there is plenty of precedent on a daily basis, several times a day. In Sujawiya, soldiers running into terrorists. In the area where these hostages were, it's an area that's forbidden for civilians to enter because it is the heaviest war zone in all of Gaza. And Sujawiya is the area where 20 soldiers have been killed, the worst toll of any part of Gaza, including that horrible event a couple of days ago where 9 IDF soldiers were killed. This neighborhood is really the nightmare neighborhood from the IDF's perspective. So the forces there are on full alert, and they're not really taking into account that they might run into civilians and certainly not that they might run into hostages, at least not in the capacity of just wandering around on their own. Um, how did the hostages get there is one major question that Israel is asking. Uh, we don't have a clear answer to that. The most likely thing is that they escaped, possibly because their captors were killed, possibly because their captors were distracted. Um, Maybe, they had some sort of opportunity to escape, ran towards the soldiers, hoping they would be safe. It's not clear yet whether they signaled that they're Israelis and how they signaled that they're Israelis. If so, that's something that needs to be looked into. But you have to remember the soldiers there are in severe fatigue, severely stressed. In many cases, they've been there since the beginning of the war and have not been rotated out. We don't know exactly with these soldiers. So, whatever it is, hard to believe the soldiers are directly at fault, but there might be something with the procedure that has um, gone wrong. Of course, you don't want soldiers to be too hesitant to fire in a war zone because, as I said, for every situation with hostages on the loose, there are going to be several with terrorists where opening fire first is a priority. So I don't know if there's really a solution for this because it's a very uncommon event, but that doesn't make it any less tragic. It's hard to find a silver lining for this kind of thing, but there are two um, good indications that Israel can take from this, two positive indications. One is that Hamas is losing control of Sajawiyah, which we knew, but if they can't keep track of an asset as important as the hostages, that means that they're not able to keep hold of any of their main strategic assets in that area. So hopefully that means fighting in this nightmarish area is coming to a close. Of course, we don't know that for sure. The problem is tunnel system, which while Israel's making progress on destroying, has not um, has not destroyed. Um, the other good news is that Hamas is clearly able to keep hostages alive, even in the most intense war zones. So that would indicate that a lot of the hostages are still alive. And indeed, what I'm hearing from Israeli intelligence sources is that most of the hostages are still alive. So if you ever hear rumors that everyone's dead or anything like that, that's not true. Having said that, it seems right now that we're at a critical point for the hostages. There seem to be more dying every single day. Just a few hours before this incident, the IDF released the names of three other hostages that were found dead and that were apparently killed by Hamas while they were hostages. And so far, 27 hostages are known to be dead. That doesn't mean that there aren't further dead. There probably are. Most of them were executed by Hamas. It doesn't seem that many or any that we know of were killed by Israeli bombings, which means that Hamas is quite good at sheltering them from bombings. Also, an indication that they're quite good at sheltering themselves from the bombings, which is again why it's so important to go in on foot, to have boots on the ground, as we discussed in the last episode. There's really a feeling that the time that the hostages have is running out. Um, Even the healthy ones are turning up dead sometimes. Then we know of some that are not healthy. They have medical conditions that require constant care. That even in the best of times in Israel, with all the facilities, might be having health trouble now. And Hamas is not necessarily interested in treating their ailments, and even if it is, it's not necessarily capable of treating their ailments. It is important not to draw any wide conclusions on how all the hostages are being held from one case or another, because we're talking about different groups, different organizations, different parts of the Gaza Strip. They're not always necessarily even in communication with their commanders. So one group could be treating their hostages quite well. We saw that when the hostages were released, while others could be enduring the worst possible abuse. So unfortunately, I can't shed too much light on the conditions in which people are being held. All I hear is some rumors now and then about how people are being held, but there's nothing confirmed, except for the fact that I can tell you that as far as Israel knows, most of them are still alive. Now, Hamas seems to have upped the amount of people that it's killing. That's probably due to two reasons. One is that they're getting increasingly angry and frustrated. Uh, they're losing the war. A lot of their friends are getting killed. Family members are getting killed, so they're probably killing some hostages out of revenge. In other cases, they might have to escape quickly under difficult conditions with short notice, and they might want to um, kill their hostages rather than try to drag them along in a way that would weigh them down. So those are the two things that seem to be happening and why more hostages are getting killed. It also looks like in the case today, some hostages are able to start to plan an escape, and maybe others are trying to escape and getting killed while trying to escape. Indeed, I know that the IDF is aware of two cases of that among the 27 that um, that have been killed. This is, of course, also a strategic problem for Israel. It's not only a human tragedy; it's very much a human tragedy, but it's not only human tragedy. This puts a lot of pressure on the IDF to try to get the hostages out. It puts a lot of pressure on the Netanyahu government to try to get the hostages out. And even before this had happened, um, the families of hostages were trying to up their um, protests and struggle to get their loved ones out. This will make the impetus for that much more serious, and I think we're going to see, I'm almost sure we're going to see much bigger demonstrations after this. And I believe we're also going to see a hunger strike from the families of hostages, which will put unbelievable pressure on Israel to do something. Now, the negotiations for the hostages are not going well, despite reports a few days ago that another hostage deal was likely in a week. which would be 3, 4 days from now, if you believe the reports from that point, there really hasn't been any progress. And there's two reasons there hasn't been any progress. One, Israel has refused so far to put an offer on the table. It believes that if it made a deal right now, the deal would be very bad, and it wants to put more military pressure on Hamas, and was hoping that with added military pressure, Hamas would start to crumble and would be more amenable to a deal. On one level, that's happened. Hamas has started to crumble. There's been a lot of surrenders. A lot of strongholds have fallen to Israeli forces. But on the other hand, Hamas has scored two triumphs in that time. One was the killing of 9 soldiers in Sajawiyah. The other, the events of today, which weren't of their doing, but played well into their strategic position. Even if those things had not happened, it doesn't appear that Yahya Sinwar has interest in a deal. Sources close to him say they believe that he thinks that making that hostage deal was a mistake. He thought it was a good idea at the time because he thought it would slow Israel down more than it did, but it didn't. So he feels he lost leverage and didn't get the return that he wanted. So Sinwar doesn't seem to be interested in the deal. And even if Qatar leadership is interested in one, they don't have the hostages. So they need Sinwar's approval. He's not interested. And that's also one of the reasons that Israel's not making an offer now. Because Sinwar doesn't particularly want one, they would have to make a really generous offer to Hamas. And the last thing Israel feels right now is the need to be generous to Hamas. But this might change that. This might force Israel to have to make an offer that it doesn't particularly want to make, and that Sinwar can reject, and then Israel might have to up. So this puts Israel's bargaining position in a bad place. In the last few days, Netanyahu has not been willing to meet with the families of the hostages. The last meeting did not go very well. Um, and there weren't really any new developments, so he probably didn't want to just say, we don't really have much to say, which is understandable. But now he's going to have to meet them. And when he says to them that there are no new developments, he's going to run into backlash, I think, that's going to make the last meeting look relatively calm. It was anything but. So we can expect movement on this. Israel will be under a lot of pressure to do something about the hostages. Uh, Not clear that even if they do, Hamas is going to be amenable. So, to recap, most of the hostages are still alive. Unfortunately, we've reached a point now where more are dying, and that may continue to happen. So, we've reached a tipping point. Um, and this has improved Hamas's bargaining position on another deal, which still does not look close. So, I wish I had better news on this front, but at least I can say that most of the hostages are still alive. And hopefully, they get out as soon as possible. Okay, so let's get to some of our questions. These questions came before the events of today, so they're not related. Syra, who's a very, very dear friend of mine, and I'm glad you're watching these, asked me, how do you see Jake Sullivan's visit to Israel? It seems there is a rift between the United States and Israel on how this war should be conducted. How will it have an impact on Israel's efforts to win this war? So this is a question on everyone's mind. How do the American timelines line up with the Israeli ones? And how are they affecting Israeli strategy? So my personal view, and it's also based on people I've talked to who are in the know, is that this is not a very big point of difference between Israel and the United States. The United States has kept the timeline vague. They've said weeks instead of months. When they formulated that timeline, and we're talking about sometime in January, reports differ on that. That was a timeline they came to while talking to Israelis. So, to some extent, it's a response to what Israel has told the United States that it can do and the timeline in which it can do it. So, it does take that into account. It's the idea behind it is not to say to Israel, you can't finish this operation and win against Hamas. The United States believes that winning against Hamas is very important. It's to say you can't do this forever. You can't keep doing this kind of um, combat that's putting civilians at risk forever. So you have to achieve those goals in a circumscribed amount of time. It doesn't appear to me that if Israel needs 2 weeks more, let's say, than the United States asks for, there's going to be some kind of major crisis. There is if Israel is still doing this in March, then it might reach ahead. But as I've already discussed in previous episodes, I don't think Israel has the desire or necessarily even the capability, more from an economic perspective, to keep this war going for that long. By the way, speaking of the economics, according to the latest budget projections, Israel is going to be in so much debt that it actually is against the law. So Israel is going to have to cut a whole bunch of budget programs, and that's just based on um, a shorter projection of what this war is going to be. If it goes longer, it could really get out of control, um, and you can't keep rotating the reserves in and out forever. So I just don't think that this will affect the timeline of the war all that much. I think the real issue between the United States and Israel is the two-state one. And that's where the problems are going to arise. So I don't think the timeline is really going to stop Israel from winning. The IDF is pretty confident that they can achieve most of what they want to achieve during the time the United States has given Israel. And the US has also said Israel doesn't need to stop at that point. It can continue to have rolling operations, but they have to be more focused. And that means that Israel has more time to achieve goals, like taking up specific squads, leaders, tunnels, things of that sort. So I don't think that this will have any impact on Israel's efforts to win the war. It can maintain US support and can complete the objectives if it thinks this through correctly. Okay, so Fred asks, one of the reasons for Oslo was because the PLO was still committing acts of terror against Israel, directing the first intifada from Tunisia, as well as attacks against Israelis and Jews outside Israel. If Israel agrees to an exile situation where Hamas goes off to Algeria or another country, aren't we just going to see Hamas begin to step up attacks abroad? We saw today two Hamas cells get arrested, one consisting of 7 terrorists in Denmark, and the other consisting of 4 terrorists in Germany and the Netherlands. What are your thoughts about exile versus simply eradicating Hamas on the battlefield? Okay, so I think Fred, there you're making it seem like Israel has might have an intentional policy of letting Hamas go into exile and leaving them alone. That's not the case. The Israeli policy is, both in statement and in deed, that Hamas leadership anywhere in the world is not safe. That Israel will kill them anywhere that they are in the world. I talked yesterday about an idea someone in the IDF had of letting Sinwar leave in exchange for a ceasefire. I don't think they'll adopt that. But even if they do, the plan would be to kill Sinwar later. So there's no desire on the Israeli part to let Hamas exist in exile. It's just that it's harder to kill them in exile, or it's harder to destroy an organization in exile, I should say, than it is in Gaza. So the main goal of the operation right now, aside from releasing the hostages, is making sure that Hamas can't rule Gaza, because that's something Israel can achieve and will make Israel notably more secure. But that doesn't mean that Israel wants Hamas in exile. As you noted, when you have a terrorist organization in exile, they can do all sorts of things. And Israel wants to prevent that as well. But if Israel could choose uh, destroy them in exile or destroy them in Gaza, right now it would destroy them in Gaza because that is the number one strategic concern. But in the long term, Israel has vowed they will kill all of the leadership of Hamas that took part in uh, in October 7th. And Qatar has taken that so seriously that it's told Hamas leaders that it can't protect them anymore. So I think Israel is doing that, and Israel should do that. I mentioned in the last episode that maybe Israel should consider keeping them alive so they have leverage over them till the end of the war. And that's something to consider. But under no circumstances should Israel consider not killing anyone involved in this. It would weaken Israeli deterrence, and there's also the question of justice for the families and everyone involved. Okay, final question from Ian. Why would the PA want Hamas in government with them? We saw this show in 2005, like chickens supporting KFC. And then he added, I have seen Munich, so I am an expert on the Israeli response. Okay, yeah. Thanks, Ian. Longtime friend of the show. Why would the PA want Hamas in government with them? Uh, well, there's a saying in Israel. It's sometimes better to have someone on the inside pissing out of the tent than someone on the outside pissing into the tent. Which means if you have a toxic um, actor that you must be involved with in one way or another, it's sometimes better to have them on the inside and causing damage to someone else. So the idea is Hamas is right now on the ropes militarily, so they can be controlled more easily than if Hamas is strong militarily. But on the other hand, they're so popular that they can't be ignored. So the strategy they're thinking of is co-opting Hamas, and then by making them more irrelevant, their popularity will go down. I agree with you that's not necessarily going to work. In fact, I'm almost sure it won't work. But I would posit to you what would work. If they're shut out of the government, then the most popular organization in the West Bank by a mile has is angry, armed, and coming to get you with most of the support of of the population. You can dull that and play for time in theory if they're part of the government. So it's not so much that the PA have any illusions about Hamas. They know that they're scorpions and that they're going to get stung by the scorpion at one point or another, to use that analogy. But they're hoping to play for time until that happens and to take advantage of the fact that Hamas is weak in order to get some structural mechanism where they have control over them. But they have no illusions, and I doubt any of this will work. And one thing that's important to remember is that Hamas and the PA have negotiated over having shared coalition governments on several occasions, and it's always failed. And I think it'll fail this time. There's more impetus for both sides to come to an agreement than usual, but the international community is going to make sure that the PA pays such a price, I think, for bringing Hamas in that ultimately they'll decide that it's not worth it. And I think the PA will probably end up trying to put too many limitations on Hamas, and Hamas won't agree either. So I don't see it happening, but that's kind of why they're negotiating at this point. So I apologize. This was a very sad one, and I'm not necessarily in the best mood, but I hope you understand. Um, So this was another episode of Israel Explained. If you liked it, please subscribe to the channel and tell your friends all about it. And tomorrow, I will definitely try to record another one, and see you then.